This video concerns the differences and similarities between classical and popular harmony. These days, the distinction between classical music and all of the many forms of popular music is very sharp and is accepted as basically an either-or question. In general, this distinction is primarily social and economic. Popular music is so much more popular in the culture and in monetary terms that classical music has been relegated to a small but high-status niche activity. But of course, the difference between these two genres also include the basic materials that make up the music itself: the melody, the rhythm, the instrumentation, the harmony. A listener can usually tell within an instant whether a piece is classical or popular. And there's not a lot of overlap between the two. But this extreme differentiation wasn't always the case. In the late 1800s, the division between popular and classical music was more one of degree than of kind. The two existed on a kind of continuum of styles, sharing most of the basic musical approach, and really only differing on the level of seriousness and complexity and length, sophistication. The light classical styles that developed into popular music were found in operettas and theater music, as well as the newer cabaret and music hall and parlor songs that were widely sold at the time on affordable sheet music. What this means is that if you look at the popular song from this era and at a serious art song of the same time, they share a lot of elements in common. For example, compare the very popular, maybe even the very first hit song called After the Ball, written in 1891 by Charles Harris, with a Tchaikovsky romance, which is a kind of song, of 1893, so basically contemporaneous.
И в душе тревожной умолкают муки, и дышать всей грудью в эту ночь легко. Ночь единая
So we can see that the Harris is much simpler. It's written for amateurs to be able to play and sing, but it still has a lot in common with the Tchaikovsky in terms of the texture, the phrasing, the rhythm, the sort of general harmonic approach. And this was typical of early popular songs. They were just really simplified art music, composed for the literate musicians out of the same vocabulary as the other music of the day. And I should stress that being able to read and play from music was a very common skill, much more common than it is now. It was the main way that people were able to play new music, right? There wasn't any radio or phonographs, so if they wanted to play a new song, they had to go out and get the sheet music, bring it home, and play it for themselves. What changed this dynamic were exactly that: recordings, radio, other technologies that allowed for a much more diverse range of sources and performance styles to be disseminated. And it also meant that people didn't have to play music for themselves. If they wanted to hear it, they could just put a record on, turn the radio on, and this led to a huge decline in the ability to read and perform. These technologies led to an explosion of new styles and genres beginning in the years after World War I. All this coincided with a new generation of songwriters and performers who were much less rooted in the 19th century European styles. Songwriters like Irving Berlin, George Gershwin, Jerome Kern, Duke Ellington, Cole Porter, and Richard Rodgers radically changed the musical vocabulary and emotional content of popular music. Likewise, performers such as Louis Armstrong and Bing Crosby and Benny Goodman and Billie Holiday originated radically new ways to present that music that was only distantly related to classical practice. So much of the songs written in this era, which extends from, say, about 1920 to 1955, was written for Broadway musicals or revues. A revue was just a collection of songs without a storyline behind it, whereas a musical or a musical comedy was understood to have a plot that all the songs fit into. So these songs were written for the stage, but if it was a hit, it would immediately be covered by dozens of other singers and instrumentalists in a multitude of styles and approaches. Sometimes a song would be so popular that versions of it would continue to be made for decades, some of them even up to the present day. The usual name for a song like this is a standard, and all of the songs we're going to be studying this semester can be considered standards. All the popular music of this era was also considered or was closely identified with jazz, although the definition and cultural meaning of the term jazz has shifted quite a bit over time, as we'll see. But the harmonic origins of popular music of this era was very much to be found in the late 19th century Romantic era, and a lot of those elements remained for many decades, although with very significant differences which grew as the music became a distinct tradition in its own right. The differences between these two, that is, classical music tradition and popular music tradition, can be summed up like this. In classical music, the triad is the basic harmonic unit. In popular music, seventh chords become the basic harmonic unit. In classical music, harmony is always specified by inversion. In popular music, harmony is not specified by inversion, but just by root position. In classical music, non-harmonic tones are considered to be dissonances within the basic triadic structure, and they need to be resolved. In popular music, non-harmonic tones often simply became included in the chord and were considered extensions of it. In classical music, harmony is specifically set out by the score, and you cannot deviate from it. In popular music, harmony of the sheet music is considered only the starting point and can be altered or entirely changed depending on the creativity of the performers. Finally, in classical music, harmony is usually part of a non-repeating form, sometimes of very great length, like a symphony or an opera. So there's an almost infinite number of variations and combinations of chords within that piece. In popular music, though, harmony is almost always part of a short repeating song form of 12 or 32 bars. So the range of possible combinations is much, much smaller. All right, so let's look at these individually. First, triads versus seventh chords. The triad is still the core essential component of the harmony of popular music, but with the addition of a fourth tone, the seventh, above the root. All right, let's look at the seventh chords that would occur then in a major scale. On the first scale degree, you have a major seventh chord. That's a major triad with a major seventh above. The second scale degree gives you a minor seventh, which is a minor triad with a minor seventh. Third scale degree, same thing, minor triad, minor seventh. Fourth scale degree, like the first scale degree, gives you a major seventh chord, that's a major triad and a major seventh. The fifth scale degree, as we've seen many times, gives you a dominant seventh, that's a major triad with a minor seventh. The sixth scale degree is another minor seventh, minor triad, minor seventh. And the seventh scale degree gives you what we call a half diminished seventh chord. So that's a diminished triad with a minor seventh above it. So the addition of the seventh does not affect the function of the chords. Right? The 1, the 3, and the 6 are still tonic functioned. The 2 and the 4 are still subdominant functioned, and the 5 and the 7 are still dominant functioned, although in practical terms, the 7 is really never used. It's almost always the 5. But what has changed is the general sound quality of the chords. Sevenths have a way of softening or complicating the sound of a triad that they're attached to. It's sort of like the difference between a primary color, like red or yellow or blue, and a more complex color, like blue-green or pastels or something like that. Seventh chords were also common in the late Romantic era of classical music, but they were used in addition to triads and other chord types. In the era of jazz-based popular music, seventh chords became nearly universal, and they're sort of what give it its characteristic sounds. When someone says jazz chords, that's what they're talking about. Second thing, root position versus inversions. When we analyze traditional classical music, the inversion of the chord is specified. That's what the figured bass numbers are for. And the various bass notes have a distinct effect on the way the chords sound and how they can be used. In popular music, though, this practice is mostly disregarded, and the chords are indicated by simple chord names, without any reference to the bass note. For example, a passage that would look like this in traditional analysis might look like this in popular music analysis. There are several reasons why this probably happened. Firstly, as we'll see in a second, the assumption in most popular music is that the performer has creative freedom to interpret the song however they choose. So musical notation became more general and simplified and sort of open-ended to allow for this. Secondly, nearly all ensemble performances of this music had a bass player whose primary role is to spell out the main notes of the harmony. And while this often includes other notes beside the root, in practice, a bass player will nearly always play the root at some point in the bar. So it's simple as just to simply round down to the root position in the chord labeling and leave it to the players. If there is a specific bass line that a composer wants, the main practice is to use what we call slash notation. For example, if you wanted to maintain the bass line of the traditional example above, in pop notation, you might do this. That is, simply put a line under the chord and then write the desired bass note beneath. Otherwise, the assumption is that the root would be the likeliest choice. Note also that we don't have to put sevenths on all the Roman numerals. In jazz-based music, it is just assumed, and to add all those sevenths would be redundant. Although it's not uncommon to see 5/7, I think, just because people are so used to it. Third difference is non-harmonic tones versus extensions. The most basic principle of traditional harmony is that any tones which appear in the context of a defined harmony that are not members of the triad are considered dissonances and must be resolved. There's a number of long-established types of non-harmonic tone, passing tones, neighbor notes, suspensions, etc., and they have formed the most basic grammar for how music was put together at the note-to-note level. In popular music, much of that grammar remains, but with a much laxer attention to detail. Similar to the way formal English grammar is still part of everyday speech, but with lots of irregular usages and slang and shortcuts. Where this is most obvious is in the way that pop harmony expands the concept of chords to include almost any other note, either as an extension or an alteration, without necessarily defining them as a dissonance. Let's look at another simple comparison. In traditional terms, the D in the melody of this first example would be a non-harmonic tone. It's part of a 2-1 suspension. And the A in the alto also would be considered non-harmonic, a passing tone to the B in the next measure. The point is that any note that doesn't belong to the chord has to be resolved to one that does. This dissonance-consonance push and pull is a big part of how that style of music works. Now compare that with this excerpt. This is a little bit from a standard called Stella by Starlight, and you would really only see the top line in the sheet music. The bottom line I'm putting there just so you know what the chords look like. And we don't need to fully analyze this excerpt right now, but I want to just look at the melody notes in measures 1, 3, and 5. In the first measure, the A is not part of an E half diminished chord, which is E, G, B flat, D. And likewise, the F is not part of a C minor seventh chord. And the G is not part of the F minor seventh chord in measure 5. Yet they're all held for the entire measure without either preparing really or resolving them against the harmony. This is a quite different attitude to the traditional concept. Basically, it's an expansion of the concept of a harmony to include harmonically dissonant notes without necessarily fixing them by turning them into consonances right away. Number 4, notation versus improvisation. This is maybe the biggest difference between popular music of the jazz era and classical music, and that's the degree to which performers could take liberties with the written music. This is a little ironic since up until the Romantic era, improvisation was very much part of the traditional skills of concert performers. For instance, both Bach and Beethoven were particularly famous for it. In any case, by the late 19th century, that is about the time there was a differentiation between classical and popular music, there came to be a culture of very strict adherence to the written score. And also, by this point, the veneration of the great masters, Mozart and Beethoven and all the famous composers, had grown to the point where the idea of improvising on Beethoven, for example, was unthinkable. For popular music, though, this did not really apply. It was expected that a song was just the raw material for whatever a performer was inspired to do. For the whole history of popular music, it has been considered more as an entertainment than an art, and keeping people surprised and engaged while also giving them something familiar is a key to entertaining and to the entertainment business. For example, let's compare two versions of Fats Waller's famous song, Ain't Misbehavin'. The first is how it would have looked if you had bought the original sheet music back in the late 20s. The second is a transcription of a solo piano version done by the great jazz pianist Art Tatum, about 10 years or so later. As you can see, Tatum has changed the key, he's altered the melody, he's added chords, added ornamentations and alterations, and this is just the beginning where he's keeping things relatively straight. Ain't Misbehavin', like all popular songs of this time, was played and sung in thousands of different forms and arrangements. This was very much expected and desired since it kept the song alive and kept royalties coming in. And it was one of the main features of writing a hit. It's like if there were hundreds and hundreds of different versions of Beethoven's Fifth, each with its distinctive twist or individual take. Of course, a song is much shorter, but that was also part of the point. Which brings up the last major difference that we want to mention, and that is maybe the most obvious one, length. By the early 20th century, concert music had expanded, with pieces often lasting for 45 minutes or more for instrumental works, hours for operas. Even concert songs, or art songs, were typically 4 or 5 minutes, and often through-composed, meaning that the music never repeated. Popular songs, on the other hand, fell into the 3 to 4 minute range in the mid-1900s, and still do to this day. Whether there is some law of human attention spans that might keep them at this length, I don't know. The length of songs and the fact that they almost always contain 2 or more repetitions of material means that the actual amount of music is probably only a minute or so. All this requires that the materials that make up a song need to be highly functional. That is, they have to do their job quickly and memorably, and as we'll be seeing in the songs of this era, very tightly constructed with an overriding goal of constant forward motion. So there's a lot of sort of harmonic formulas that go into making up these songs to keep them clear and moving forward and memorable.